Many years ago, when I was on gap year, I spent a long time in Japan where I met a German girl. Let's call her Dee. Dee and I quickly became good friends and explored many beautiful corners of Japan together. Once, we planned a trip to a small village and decided to stay there for one night. As it was quite remote, there was only one bus a day into town. So we checked the bus timetable and planned a perfect 2-day itinerary. The village was beautiful, and the people there, although a little shy, were very friendly and welcoming. We had a great time there. In the afternoon of the second day, we packed our bags, made our way to the bus station. It's not easy to get a taxi there, so we walked to the station. Luckily, the village was small, and we didn't have much luggage, so it wasn't too hard. On the way to the station, I saw a forked path with what looked like something glittering at the end of it. "What's that?" I asked Dee curiously. "It looks pretty." Dee was a bit confused and looked around. "What is pretty?" she asked. "Right over there." I pointed to the end of the path, curiosity getting the better of me. "Come on, let's have a look." Dee looked a little reluctant. After all, we had a full itinerary, and if we wandered into the path, we might run into something unexpected or even miss the bus. But it was as if I was under some kind of spell and insisted on exploring. Eventually, Dee followed me up the path. Fortunately, we didn't have far to go before we reached the end of the road. There was a small, picturesque, and slightly dilapidated temple. I pushed open the door and stepped inside to find a clay statue of a god looking down at me. Although I had no idea what kind of deity it was, I felt a strong urge to kneel down and pray. So I did. Meanwhile, Dee stepped out of the temple, looking a little unhappy. "Hurry up, I'll wait outside." She has every right to be upset. After all, I was the one who spoiled the plan. But I knew she was a straightforward girl and wouldn't be upset for long. After the prayer, we hurried back to the bus station. Time was running out, so we picked up the pace and ran along the muddy path. Finally, we were almost at the bus stop, and from a distance, we could see the bus pulling up to the platform. We waved our hands and shouted as we ran as fast as we could, trying not to miss the shuttle bus. Just then, a small truck came out of another side street and crashed into the side of the bus. It hit the side of the bus so hard. For a moment, glass flew across the road, and some of it almost flew in our faces. Police cars and ambulances arrived quickly, and the scene was chaotic. Several bloodied men were carried off the bus. Dee and I were terrified. We realized that if we had got on the bus earlier as planned, we might have been among the victims. My heart was filled with gratitude, thinking that it must have been the unknown God who saved us. That night, we had to spend another night in the village. Lying on our beds, we talked about the accident and felt all the more grateful that we had escaped death. But then, a question from Dee made my skin crawl. None of the children looked hurt, but why wasn't anyone there to help them get off the bus? Were they waiting for their parents to come and get them? "What children?" I asked. I didn't see any children. They were the same kids that were on the bus. Dee's voice was both confused and scared. When I ran over from a distance, I saw them all sprawled out on the back window of the bus looking at us, and I was even wondering why any school would organize a night out. But I swear, I definitely didn't see any kids at that time. So what exactly did Dee see that night? And did our lucky escape have anything to do with that temple?
It was a holiday trip with my parents when I was a child. We set off early in the morning, and before the excitement of the journey had fully worn off, I dozed off while the car was rocking. When I woke up, the car was still moving smoothly. I looked up at the time in the car. It was almost noon, but the scenery outside the car was still the same misty light as when we left at dawn, which confused me a little. It was very quiet in the car. In retrospect, I should say it was too quiet. I couldn't even hear the noise of the car itself. The only sound in the air was my own breathing. I leaned against the car window in boredom, my eyes wandering aimlessly over the landscape outside. Suddenly, without a word, my father turned on the car radio. The voices of a male and a female presenter broke the silence in the car. At first, they were just chatting and joking around, with a few commercials in between. Then, the male presenter suddenly laughed in an eerie tone and asked the female presenter if she wanted to hear an interesting story. My otherwise distracted attention was drawn to this, and I began to listen intently. The male presenter warned that it was going to be a scary and bloody story, and that it was best not to listen if there were children in the house. I glanced at my mom and dad, but they didn't react. My dad drove the car with no expression on his face, and my mom just stared straight ahead. I was a bit glad that they didn't notice. I always liked to listen to all kinds of horror stories. I was very happy that the radio was not switched off or to another channel at that time. The story begins with a serial murder in a small town. The male presenter told it in a very gripping way, but it wasn't too scary. However, the story took a sudden turn when he started describing a family of 3 who were traveling to this town. I was very interested, but soon I began to feel that something wasn't quite right, because the detailed description of the family's appearance and characteristics was too similar to ours. When he said, the woman with short brown hair was wearing a long blue dress and her eyes were staring straight ahead, I looked up and saw my mother, who dressed just like that, staring straight ahead with empty eyes and a blank expression, which frightened me so much that I immediately covered my mouth. The presenter's voice became even more sinister, as if he was gloating. He slowly continued. And her son, that little boy, who was so excited just a moment ago, is now starting to get chills down his back. I let out a short scream and tried to shout out, but I felt paralyzed, and my throat felt as if it was blocked. I took several deep breaths before shakily saying, "Turn off the radio, Mom. Turn off the radio for me." But Mom ignored me. I quickly covered my ears tightly, and the 2 presenters continued to talk, joking with each other about what was going to happen to the family and how it would be worth waiting for. I curled up in my seat in fear and kicked the seat in front of me with my foot as hard as I could. After what seemed like a million years, my mom's voice suddenly rang out. "What's wrong with you?" I looked up to see my mom turning to look at me with a surprised look on her face, and I cried out in relief. We pulled over to the side of the road, and Mom and Dad comforted me and asked me what had happened. I cried and sobbed, trying to describe to them what I had just experienced. They were very surprised and said that they had listened to the radio, but hadn't heard what I had described, and that I must have had a bad dream. To prove it, they even took me to the car and switched on the program I had just heard. It was still a man and a woman, but the voices were unfamiliar, and it was really just some local daily news. I was still frightened, because what I had just felt was so real that I didn't feel like I was dreaming. My parents insisted we continue our journey, even though I cried and screamed all the way. Fortunately, nothing happened on the journey. Where we were going was a scenic tourist area with no record of murders, let alone serial killings. But to this day, I still can't understand what I experienced that day. It was so real. Was it really just a dream?
A few years ago, right after I graduated from high school, a good friend and I had a little trip to Thailand. The trip was fantastic, but there were some incidents that happened in between that I still can't explain, and I wonder if anyone can provide a reasonable explanation. We stayed in Bangkok for 5 days, spending the first 3 days in the same motel, and that's where things happened. The motel looked quite old from the outside, but it seemed to have been renovated inside, as it was nice and clean. We were there during winter time, but it was still very hot in Bangkok. However, the moment we stepped into the motel lobby, it felt as if all the heat had been shut out, and there was an instant coolness. And this coolness was different from the kind you get from strong air conditioning. It wasn't the coolness you feel first on your arms or legs, but rather a chill crept up your spine to your scalp from the moment you walked in. In short, even though we had just escaped the scorching air, I felt somewhat uncomfortable, but I didn't think too much of it at the time. On the first day of our stay, my friend and I were both exhausted and went to bed early. But I didn't sleep well that night. I was plagued by nightmares. But when I woke up, I couldn't remember what I was dreaming about. I just vaguely remembered running all night with something chasing me. The next day, we had a great time exploring all day long. In the evening, back at the hotel, I casually turned on the TV, but the screen was just static. So, I called the reception to ask them to check it out. The staff came quickly, but strangely, as soon as I heard his knock, the TV screen returned to normal. The staff still checked the TV but found no issues, and since it was now working fine, I didn't press any further and let him go. But just a minute after he left, the TV screen went back to static again. My friend even joked about it and said the TV must hate me. We decided to turn off the TV since we couldn't understand it anyway. I sat at the desk, opened a bag of dried mangoes we bought that day. While I was eating and checking our plans for the next day, one piece of mango fell to the floor. I instinctively bent down to pick it up from under the table, but strangely, I couldn't find it. I moved the chair and cleared the space, but there was nothing. The floor under the table was spotlessly clean, and the piece of mango had vanished. What happened next was even more chilling. My friend and I chatted for a while, and then went to sleep. The next morning, I found the half-eaten bag of dried mangoes was gone, leaving only an empty bag on the table. My friend and I looked at each other in confusion. We both remembered there was plenty left the night before. Despite our doubts, we continued with our planned trip. That day, we visited the Erawan Shrine, a famous spot with a statue facing 4 directions. We joined the crowd, circling the shrine to pay respects to each direction. Suddenly, a Thai man grabbed my arm. I was startled and tried to shake him off. He seemed urgently trying to tell me something, but I didn't understand and shouted, "What are you doing?" My friend rushed over and pushed the man away, shouting, "Let her go." The man furrowed his brows, muttered something under his breath, and walked away. Some nearby onlookers glanced curiously at us. A couple who seemed to have heard what he said looked at me with surprise and a bit of fear. We were completely baffled and felt our mood had been ruined. That night, back at the hotel, I still couldn't sleep well, feeling as if someone was talking in my dream, but I couldn't understand him. In the middle of the night, I vaguely felt someone blowing air into my ear. Seconds later, I was fully awake and startled. That feeling was too real. Even after waking up, I still felt as if someone was lying behind me, breathing down my neck. I was terrified. I had always laughed at horror movie characters for investigating when they clearly shouldn't. But now that I was in that situation, I understood. Despite being nearly paralyzed with fear, I felt an uncontrollable urge to turn around and look behind me. So, holding my breath, I slowly turned my head. Those few seconds felt incredibly long, and my mind raced with horrible images. Fortunately, there was nothing behind me. I sighed in relief, trying to calm my pounding heart. But as I turned back, I was startled again. My friend was lying on the other bed, facing me, and her eyes are wide open, staring straight at me. I screamed and jumped out of bed. It seemed I had also awakened her. Groggily, she complained, "What are you yelling for in the middle of the night?" I was almost in tears as I asked why she was staring at me with her eyes wide open. "What?" She rubbed her eyes and sat up. "What are you talking about?" I was asleep. I shakily told her about my experience, and she became somewhat scared, but mostly skeptical, suggesting I might be having a nightmare. I'm starting to doubt myself too, and apologized for waking her up. She said with a yawning, "It's fine. I was having a nightmare anyway. I don't know why, but these past 2 days, I keep dreaming about being chased, and I always wake up feeling so tired." Her words rekindled the fear in me. I told her I had been having similar nightmares since we checked in. We ended up spending the rest of the night wide awake, sharing a bed, too scared to sleep alone. As soon as dawn broke, we packed our bags and left the hotel. After moving to a new hotel, we didn't encounter anything strange anymore. However, we both suffered from a low-grade fever for quite some time after. For the rest of our stay in Thailand, we made sure to pray at every temple we saw, but it didn't seem to make much difference. My health didn't fully recover until I started university.